Good to have your company. You're watching Round Table. A tough winter lies ahead for Europe as the Kremlin curbs gas supplies, and that's got Europe scrambling to keep the lights and heating on this winter. But what about the future? Britain's opening up the North Sea for oil and gas exploration, and the Netherlands is considering whether to pump gas from an earthquake-prone area. Very good to have you along. I'm David Foster. Western Europe's biggest gas supplier is Norway, and it's already pumping gas at near capacity. But that hasn't stopped the threat of possible blackouts this winter. In the Netherlands, the government may agree to release more gas from what is known as the Groningen gas field, which has enough gas to replace Germany's gas imports from Russia. But there's a problem. The field, which has $1 trillion worth of gas, is being shut down as drilling has triggered earthquakes. So what can Europe do to avert future energy shocks? Well, if the three people joining us don't know the answers to whether we have enough gas, then nobody does. In London, we have Catalina Spataru, Professor in Global Energy and Resources and Director of UCL Energy Institute. In London, James Waddell, Head of European Gas and Global LNG at Energy Aspects, and in Groningen, Nienke Busscher, that's in the Netherlands, Research Coordinator of the Knowledge Platform, Societal Impacts of Mining. And if that's a little complicated, much more obvious is the fact that, Nienke, and we will come to you in just a moment, you have been there when there have been earthquakes in Groningen. James, let me ask you first of all, France, 97% capacity at the moment. I read today, Germany, 92%. The EU has 15% more gas in storage than it did 12 months ago. It's going to be okay, isn't it?
Well, I think we're looking at a situation where this winter we've got very strong inventories, but we've got to remember we've still got a little bit of Russian gas that we could still lose through the pipelines going through Ukraine. That's about 15 billion cubic meters per year. And next year, it's going to be a problem to refill because we're going to lose on a year-on-year basis another big chunk of Russian gas over the course of next year. So we really need to preserve a lot of those inventories to have a fighting chance of making it through the following winter.
So relatively okay at the moment, but it all depends on what happens. If the Russians cut off their gas supplies entirely, it could be difficult, which is where Groningen comes in. How important a gas field is that? What could it do to European supplies, James?
It's been phased down as a field over many years. Next year, it's only being planned to produce about 2.8 billion cubic meters of gas, which is very small in aggregate terms within Europe. But if we are in a crisis where we're having to generate a lot of demand destruction across Europe in order to balance, we reckon that field could be ramped up to something like 15 or 17 billion cubic meters per year.
And that's how much of a difference would that make?
Chunk. That would prevent a lot of demand destruction that we're seeing across Europe. We've been seeing about 20 BCM of industrial demand destruction. So we could undo a lot of that effect and prevent and allow gas-intensive industry to function better.
Okay, so Nienke, there you are. We're talking about the dynamics of what happens if Europe gets low, and the Groningen field could help replenish supplies, get everybody through difficult times. It's worth it, surely, isn't it, just to feel the ground move slightly underneath your feet if you know that everybody's going to be nice and warm and the lights are going to stay on?
Well, I think here it is worthwhile to give a bit of an explanation of why the gas field has closed down in the first place. Already for decades here in Groningen, the earth has been trembling. So the earthquakes have happened over decades. Up until today, 1,800 plus earthquakes have happened. And this is also the reason why many civil society organizations and local residents have been asking for the closing of this field. And in 2018, this was a political decision because it's simply unsafe to continue gas extraction.
I'm wondering if, in fact, an idea that's been mooted that if the gas is absolutely essential, the European Union pays the people of Groningen to move away, puts them into new housing, and therefore the gas fields won't be bothering anybody anymore. I'll come to you about that a little bit later, if I may, but I want to hear from the Dutch Energy Minister right now.
Well, I think everyone realizes that this is not a national crisis, but a European crisis. So we all have to get rid of our Russian dependency as soon as possible. And we all have to take difficult measures to cut our gas uses and make sure that we are well prepared for next winter. And in an extreme situation with safety issues, we can consider extreme measures such as Groningen, but at this time there is a lot of other things to do.
When he talks there about extreme situations, do you think he means if hospital patients are in danger or what?
Yeah, indeed. This is the line the government is taking at this moment. So they're trying to be more transparent about what reasons there will be to reopen the field, or at least, well, to open up the gas, to extract more gas. And I think that is good because we're talking about a situation here in Groningen where residents have very little trust in the government. So I think this transparency is a good thing. And indeed, it will reopen when hospitals cannot be heated or households come into trouble.
Catalina, Germany needs more energy than any other European country, and it has the biggest problems at the moment, doesn't it?
I think everyone has a problem currently, but the fundamental pillar of energy security is diversity, and diversity alone. And depending on where we look and what time scale we look, if we look for short term or for long term. So if we look for short term, then to keep everything safer, or a safer option would be to further prolong the life of the nuclear plants in Germany and France.
Yeah, I think at the moment it's getting 6% of its power needs from nuclear plants, which it had planned to shut down. That doesn't sound like 1/15, if you like, of a country's supplies. It doesn't sound like it's going to make very much difference.
Indeed, there are other options also. So another option could be governments to ask citizens and companies to reduce gas consumption to avoid the emergency cuts. So the suggested measures could be including like purchasing electrical heaters and installing wood stoves.
Just before we began recording this program, James, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, was talking about a price cap on gas, saying that the European Union would be doing a very dangerous thing if it actually set a cap, a limit on what it would pay for gas, because other people elsewhere might pay more, and they would then get the gas because they were willing to go that extra mile. So what is the position regarding a price cap at the moment? Then I've got another thing that he said that I want to bring up with you. Price cap first.
Well, he's exactly right. I mean, you have to be arguing to put a price cap that these prices are not reflective of any type of reality, when the truth is that the European benchmark wholesale markets have been attracting lots of LNG in to replace Russian gas, and they've been feeding into lower demand. Now, if you artificially bring down the price, you're going to increase demand and reduce the ability to attract those LNG cargoes ahead of Asia. And if it gets cold in Asia, those markets are just going to draw the LNG away, and we're going to be in more of a crisis than we would otherwise be. So it is dangerous to play with these price signals.
Okay, I'm quite interested also in something I found out today, which is that France is paying roughly 90 euros per megawatt hour, and Italy and Germany 133 euros. Why such a discrepancy when all of these countries that I was looking at, those are just two that I mentioned, are within the European Union? Why isn't it the same price?
Well, we've got a pipeline grid that was built back in the 1970s, 1980s, even during the Soviet Union, to channel gas from the Soviet Union and then from Russia into Western Europe. And the truth is that that grid doesn't work very well in reverse when you're trying to offset a massive shortfall in Russian gas and replace that with LNG. Just the pipeline connections within Europe are not built and not sturdy enough. So now we're trying to reposition LNG import infrastructure around Europe to overcome some of those bottlenecks. And that's why when you've got so much supply coming in at one end, but you physically can't move it across into Central and Eastern Europe, that's why you've got these massive price differentials.
So he's also saying, Nienke, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, that there should be an encouragement across the European Union to drill for gas in new fields. That doesn't sound very encouraging for campaigners such as yours, which want to keep existing fields shut down if they're going to be looking for new gas elsewhere. Or does that give you hope that they're going to move away, that their interest won't be in places like Groningen?
Yeah, let me first. I'm not a campaigner of keeping the field open, but I'm a campaigner of getting across the societal impacts of opening this field. Um, but what that would mean, and I think it's good to refer back to your question, if you would compensate people with houses, this is already a process that we have been in for years. So already since 2012, several houses have been demolished because they are unsafe. And thousands more will follow, which has a huge health impact for people, human rights violations, but also the loss of quality of life. Um, and if the gas field will open, it will mean that these impacts will aggravate even more.
So tell me what happened when, I mean, you said there had been thousands of earthquakes, tremors, whatever you want to call them, but you're there, you're a Groningen resident. What happens?
What happens to houses is that they get severely damaged over time, and even immediately after an earthquake. And we have institutions here that seek to resolve these issues, but the government has responded in a very bureaucratic way. So processes of getting your house, your damage repaired is very long. It can take up to 1.5 years before you know that you will actually get the money to repair the cracks in your house. But there is also a massive safety operation at play here. So 27,000 houses here in the province are possibly unsafe. So that means that people or that houses will collapse and local residents cannot safely get out of their homes. And that means that currently many people feel unsafe in their own house.
And is this, just to help
and
me
this-
here, is this gas deep down or is it near the surface?
It's more or less 3 kilometers deep. So this means also that these tremors, they occur at, in the subsoils, basically, making also these tremors much more impactful than a normal tremor on the scale of Richter. So the impact is much larger than you would expect from an earthquake.
Okay, Catalina, let's talk about the dangers of doing as Olaf Scholz suggests. On the one hand, he says the gas is needed. We have to explore new areas. On the other hand, we have people in places such as Groningen saying you can't do it near us because it's really, really dangerous. And the mine that Nienke's just referred to is 3 kilometers down. What about fracking? We're going to bring up a map that shows all of the different, what they call unconventional natural gas resources right the way across Europe. And there's a lot of it pretty near the surface, which is what fracking is, or coal bed methane, I think, is a little bit deeper. If you start doing that wholesale, are we not going to see repeats of what Nienke and the people of her area are going through?
I personally think we shouldn't go with fracking at all. So we should really think about short, medium, and long term. And in medium, long term, we should invest more in renewable energy. We need really to invest in more renewable energy, but to have as a backup fossil fuel firing power plants, for example, to compensate for the variable electricity generated from the green energy sources. But renewable energy really play an important role, and this won't happen overnight. So we really need to look at diversify, and we need to be realistic in terms of timelines and policies, and governments to do more to push this to happen, especially to avoid all the delays we've seen in renewable projects and the implementation of them across Europe.
How far ahead are we? I mean, we all know it won't happen tomorrow, but there was a point when it might not have happened by 2050. Are we that much closer to it being 2035? Is the time lag coming down?
It depends really on the government's decisions in terms of policies and legislations. So we've seen, for example, the German cabinet, which published, I think was April this year, draft legislation package called Easter package, which they have effectively the biggest energy policy reform in decades. So and through this one, they look, instead of its previous goal of reaching a 65% share of renewable energy, then by 2030, the Easter package set that share to at least 80%, with the aim of almost 100% by 2035. So we need really to have in place legislations and policies and support from governments to effectively see implementation at large scale in terms of renewable sources.
We're talking about alternative here, James, and I'm wondering whether, in fact, the reason why consumption, I think it's global consumption, is falling, and I think last year it was down by 0.8%, which doesn't sound very much, but 1% of an enormous amount, which it pretty much is a huge drop. Is that because of what we're talking about, renewables coming online, or campaigns to stop people using quite as much gas?
Well, I mean, we're still looking at, we saw big price rises for global spot gas even before you had the Russia-Ukraine conflict starting up in February, just because high prices were already kicking in last August. And what that did was it drove a switch back towards coal in the European power sector for much of the second half of last year. And it started to make LNG cargoes going into South Asia uncompetitive against other sources of supply, or actually translated into lower consumption overall. So price has been a big driver of this move away from gas. And we're in a very high price environment for the next
Okay, so it's not necessarily that people are being more careful. It's not necessarily that we're moving to renewables. It's simply that people went to the even dirtier, if you like, coal sources.
It's a combination of switching, and it's also a factor of just an economic downturn, or just reducing the economics of producing things using gas or power-intensive industries.
And I guess COVID also came into it because demand wasn't quite so high. Tell me a little bit about, I think it's, as I say, 0.8%, this global contraction in terms of the use of gas. To make any kind of difference in Europe, what kind of cutbacks would we need to see in usage?
Well, it depends what we're really trying to achieve. We're seeing huge reductions in demand across Europe, and partly it's in the power sector. We switched to dirtier fuels to loosen up the balance and use less gas. In industry, we're looking at something like a 20 to 25% drop in industrial gas consumption going into this winter compared to the 5-year average. In terms of household demand, we're looking at about a 10%. Now, what's not economically damaging is persuading households to consume less gas and less power. That's actually a very sensible thing. It's just at the policy-making level is how do you actually convince people to do that, and what incentives do you have to provide? If all of the burden falls on industry, then obviously that translates into either sort of inflation that we're seeing in the European economy, or it translates into people losing their jobs because this industry goes somewhere else, to cheaper places like the Middle East or the Americas, where you've got cheaper gas supply.
But are we making headway at all in terms of personal consumption? Are people listening to what they're being told, that it's absolutely vital that gas consumption goes down?
I think it's more to do with the economics. People are much more conscious now of their monthly bills than they ever were before, because retail tariffs have gone up through the roof. But at the same time, governments are doing a lot of subsidy to households, because you don't want to have lower income households having to pay so much for their energy bills. It's just not a vote winner for any politician. So this is dampening the impact of high prices on reducing that demand. And in terms of the campaigning about it, you do need a lot of information campaigns to support this. But I think it's difficult to persuade people to just do this on their own. People are used to being comfortable in winter. They're used to turning on the heating when it gets cold, simply.
But perhaps they can't afford it at the moment, as you were suggesting, sort of a Malthusian impact here, that the reason the numbers are coming down is because people are in a very difficult situation. Nienke, I want to play something from the Green Left Party of Groningen.
Extracting fossil fuels comes at a cost. It comes at a cost to people, and it comes at a cost to nature. People think that now the gas tap is being closed further, that this will mean that we have no more earthquakes. Even if we close by the deadline that the government has given itself, we still have a problem here. We should not prolong the extraction because the consequences will just go on and on and on.
So she says extracting fossil fuels comes at a cost. But the cost of not extracting fossil fuels could mean that people find themselves extremely vulnerable. They have no lighting, which can be dangerous. They have no heating, which can be terrible and fatal as well. It's a difficult position you find yourself, isn't it? Because what's the difference between a house wobbling and somebody finding that they can't afford to live any longer?
Well, I think here it's important to make a distinction between, first of all, prices. Like some people might not be able to heat their house because it's not affordable for them. So, and that I think you can have an easy response to, and it can be a political response to compensate that. And as for the availability, Groningen won't be making the entire difference there. But of course, then you come into a whole different discussion. But what we see in fossil fuel extractions and in mines in general is that they are all they all cause human rights violations. And I think as society, we should be very careful in how we make certain decisions. And the thing is, for some things you can compensate with money. But for the loss of quality of life, for the feeling of feeling unsafe in your own house, for the loss of family life, you cannot compensate.
Okay,
and
but let me just say this in English, and you may have it as well where you are. We have an acronym. It's called NIMBY. It means not in my backyard. And you say Groningen's unimportant in the big scheme of things, but if everybody acted as though no, not in my backyard, that would be antisocial, wouldn't it?
Well, the thing is, I don't think the NIMBY applies here because, in fact, there has been extraction already for decades. The NIMBY effect, in my view, really applies for people not wanting a project, but this project is already been going on for decades. And people have already experienced the severity of how it can change their lives.
Catalina, you are a professor of energy. If you are still teaching people about this in, let's say, 10 years' time, 15 years' time, what do you think your major will be? Will gas still feature heavily? Will oil still feature heavily? Or will you be talking about wind and sun and all of those things much, much more?
What is really fundamental, and I will teach, is to look at the energy security and diversity. And I think diversity is really key for any future scenarios, and depending on each country, depending on the resources in that country, depending on different policies which exist, depending on many aspects and parameters, to be honest. So, but I would say we need to think about from the perspective of energy trilemma. So in the sense, like, we need to look at the security, environment, and cost effectiveness.
James, there I was asking Catalina about what the future might look for specialists in the energy field. Let me throw this one at you. If you go back 30 years, imagine yourself in that position. You wouldn't have been talking about anything much other than oil and gas and a bit of nuclear. We have come a long way in a relatively short space of time, haven't we? Even if it's not as quick as many people would have liked.
I think at the European level, we have done quite a lot. At the global level, really, we've done almost nothing in terms of the transition to renewables from oil and gas. If you look at the relative share of renewables in global energy consumption, it has barely moved since 1980. So we need to accelerate that a lot faster. And, looking in the next 10, 20 years, yes, we can get there with a lot more investment going in, but we also have this very temporary crisis to overcome, particularly over the next 2 or 3 years. So this is why so much emphasis is now going back onto what does the global coal balance look like and what does the global gas balance look like in the short term.
Nienke, let me come to you, and I'm not asking you to sort of be the defense spokesman for those who don't want people to have gas this winter, but you're a consumer as well as a campaigner. And I wonder if you're rather thankful that Europe's gas storage supplies are at such a high level, which means taking it out of the ground in places like Groningen. You're thankful for that on the one hand, because you're not going to go cold, perhaps, and at the same time, you're worried because of what you see as the damage this is causing. It's difficult.
Yeah, it's definitely very difficult. And I think here the history of how societal impacts have been are considered in the policies, I think that is very much also why at this moment there is such a resistance towards reopening the field. And indeed, I'm thankful, and as a consumer personally, I do everything in my power to save any gas that I can.
Indeed, thank you very much indeed. The wise words. We should all do everything in our power to save as much gas as possible. Thank you for coming on the programme. Great to have your thoughts. And thank you for watching Roundtable, wherever you happen to be doing so. From me, David Foster, and the team. Goodbye.